Good afternoon and good morning, everybody, depending on where you're listening from today. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Deirdre Fulton. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And this is OAG's third series of webinars focused on COVID-19. And of course, it's good to see some of you who joined us the last time come back for more again. And welcome to all of those of you who are joining us for the first time. So I'm joined today by John Grant, OEG's senior analyst, who's been tracking the impacts since the start of the coronavirus outbreak, which is a number of weeks ago now, John.
15 weeks.
15 long weeks. And we also have Mark Clarkson, OEG's EVP of Product Management. Welcome, both of you.
Good morning.
So today, we're going to use OEG data. To look at the latest position regarding frequency and capacity. So those of you who've joined us before, those of you who are watching the COVID-19 page on OEG's website will be familiar with some of the data sets that we're providing weekly and then talking through on these webinars. We're going to have a look and see whether we're seeing any signs of recovery yet. When we talked in the last webinar back, I think on the 8th of April, we sort of tentatively felt that maybe by the end of April we might be seeing some signs of recovery, so we'll have a look at that. We're also going to take a look at some scheduled and cancelled operations and see what insights we can draw from that. There's different things happening in different markets. And then we're going to have a conversation about some of the impacts for airlines and airports. And as ever, of course, we welcome your questions. Please use the questions panel throughout the session to ask them, and we'll try and answer them as we go, if it's sort of relevant to what we're talking about then. And we do have time at the end for dealing with your questions. If we don't get to them during the session, we'll do our best to answer them in the following days and send those out to you. And lastly, the webinar is recorded and you will receive a recording, I think, possibly later today. So let's jump right in. John, what are we seeing here? This is the global picture, isn't it, over the last few weeks?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Yes, some of you may, as Deirdre said, begin to be seeing these as part of your nightmares every evening as capacity continues to decline around the globe, and the intensity of red on the heat map for the 27th of April shows you that virtually every market across the globe has been impacted by COVID-19. On a global basis, we've lost 2/3 of the weekly capacity compared to this time last year. And capacity has fallen since we started tracking this on the 20th of January through to Sunday by from 110 million to just over 30 million. So we've lost nearly 40 million weekly seats. And many of the markets, and particularly many of the major markets that we have become familiar with as being leaders in aviation capacity, are now at less than 10% of the normal weekly supply that we have expected to see. And indeed, quite a few countries and pieces of airspace have now completely locked down. So we have markets such as South Africa, India, and other points where no air services are permitted and are unlikely to be permitted for at least another week to 10 days in some cases. So it's a pretty dire situation, and perhaps explain some of the overnight news some of you may have seen regarding airline British Airways effectively announcing 12,000 redundancies and a major reorganization of their business, such as the damage that the industry is seeing at the moment.
And that sort of strikes me as a real bellwether moment for the industry, doesn't it, John, in terms of, you know, BA or big, IAG or a big established carrier who you might have thought would be better equipped perhaps to ride out this current storm that we're in.
Yeah, I think it is. And when we came into this, they were one of the airline groups that were proudly saying how deep their cash reserves were. But the other side of that is, IAG are a very sharp airline group with a very close handle on their business and making sure that they're profitable. And they would have no compunction about moving quickly and striking
Mm.
early to protect their longer term business. And undoubtedly, this is what this is what has led to yesterday's announcement.
I guess in the same way that we saw Lufthansa announcing that they were retiring aircraft from their fleet, and they're you have a sense that these airlines know what it is they need to do and what steps they need to take, and we wouldn't expect them to be
No,
doing anything else, would we?
absolutely, and they've certainly got time to be thinking about it at this moment. But I think every airline has a list of routes and services that it would describe as being under care and attention. And this is a moment when that list has probably been expanded to a point where they're saying that these really are not core,
Yeah,
and therefore we don't need to continue either operating with the frequency we have or even operating. And it's not just British Airways, it's just not the Lufthansa's. We hear that KLM and Air France are, certainly KLM are looking at what is the future, and is there a future within a group with Air France, or is there other options
mm.
available to them? So we said very early into this will change commercial aviation and the structures of airlines, alliances, and partnerships, and we're beginning to see some of that shape coming out this week.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move now to look at the regional picture. So what we're seeing here is, I think when we reported on this 2 or 3 weeks ago, Europe was maybe just over 80%, 84%, I think, down. Asia was at 65%. So, we're seeing in the case of Europe, potentially there can't be anything else left to come out, although I'm slightly hesitant to say that. Southwest Pacific, the same. And we'll come back to that because I think it's interesting to maybe talk about what's going on there. But this is it good news? It's a loaded phrase, that, isn't it? It's a slightly better picture, isn't it, for Asia?
Yes, it's a slightly better picture, and I think there is good news here. You've just got to pick the right sound bites and interpret the data. And I think the good news in one respect is that in many markets we appear to have bottomed out, and as you said, there doesn't look like there is much more capacity that can come out. And in some markets we are actually seeing specific airlines and specific countries where capacity is beginning to recover, and it's
Yeah,
recovering
yeah.
at a much slower rate than it actually declined. But at least we've arrested that slope downwards. We've plateaued, and some markets are coming out the other side.
Mm.
And we've seen more capacity coming back into the Chinese domestic market this week, partly driven, I think, by the May bank holiday, the public holiday for 5 days that starts on Friday. And airlines are, I know, aggressively pricing in China to stimulate demand and try and rebuild traffic. And we've seen
Bok
some more
choy
capacity.
fares, isn't it?
Apparently so, yes, vegetable fares. And we've seen some capacity coming back into Vietnam and into the Philippines as well. So that there is some pockets of growth in Asia that's reassuring. South Korean
Yeah.
domestic capacities come back, and despite the lockdown in Japan, there's even a bit more capacity there. So there's some positives in Asia, and in Europe. Whilst we're down at this 90% mark, Wizz Air have introduced around 450,000 seats back into the market from various destinations in Europe this week.
It feels
And
like a bold move.
it feels like a very bold move, and even operating from the home of OAG, Luton Airport, to markets such as Portugal and Spain. So it'll be interesting to see what demand there is on those aircraft. But Turkish Airlines are reintroducing domestic services from the 1st of May when the government allows them to do so. So there are these small little bits of upturn, and reassuringly at the same time, certainly in Europe and Asia, we're not seeing airlines cutting back further. And if we look further out than May, Cathay Pacific have started to reintroduce some capacity into the next couple of months as they look to pass through COVID-19 and out the other side.
Okay. I said I wanted to come back to the Southwest Pacific. We've all heard, I think, this week that New Zealand are sort of tentatively trying to reopen, not necessarily just for aviation, but the country. And there's been an interesting discussion about could New Zealand and Australia operate flights in a sort of bubble? What do you think about that, and what does that mean for the industry more widely? You know, if these two countries start flying again, but only between each other, what sort of pattern does that potentially create in other parts of the world?
Well, it's an interesting idea, and the creation of a bubble is, perfectly sound and reasonable, and facilitates a lot of trade and VFR and even business traffic between those two markets. And you can see perhaps there would almost be pockets or bubbles created in other countries around the world. So we could have a European bubble, or we could have a Benelux bubble, or we could have a Southern European bubble, or a Latin American bubble. But ultimately, they would serve a purpose, and they would begin to rebuild confidence. But I think ultimately, passing from one bubble to another is going to be one of the most important parts of the aviation and the global economy recovery, and the ability to burst those bubbles at some point and allow long haul to long haul connectivity, in whatever shape, structure, process, connecting environment, however it happens to be. But it will be an interesting experiment, particularly when the Australian government has said, there could be a possibility of no international flights outside of Australia until the end of the year, which would be a real lockdown.
Yeah. Okay.
Truth is, Deirdre, no one really knows. We are all trying to work our way through this process, and there are some great sound bites from airline CEOs at the moment about, when you make a decision, you make it because you believe it's the right decision, and as soon as you've made it, you need to change your mind and make another decision. So we're all, none of us have lived through this. This is I'm not going to say that word, but this is very strange times.
It's the reality of the situation, isn't it? Okay, you mentioned earlier that there are some positives. Let's have a look at the changes by country. So we're showing here scheduled flights by week for some of these key markets in Asia. You could be cautiously optimistic, couldn't you, looking at the picture in China, Japan, South Korea?
You could be. Interestingly, this is comparing the number of flights this week versus the number of flights last year.
Last year, yeah.
And you would look and you would be optimistic, but I think you also have to come back to the point that certainly in the case of Japan and China, these are very large domestic markets, and account for 3/4 of their normal daily operation is on domestic services. So in China's case, clearly we can see that there has been a gradual easing of capacity from about the 30th of March onwards, and we've seen some more, as I mentioned. Similarly with Japan, and similarly with South Korea, where there is a huge, almost a shuttle service between Seoul and Jeju. So, and I think it's one of the busiest routes in the world. So that's no surprise. But if you continue to look at some of the other larger and perhaps more commercial centres in their own rights, places like Hong Kong and Singapore, we still have less than 10% of the capacity that we
Yeah.
had
The
in
lack of a domestic
January.
market is very evident, isn't it?
Absolutely lack of a domestic market. And if you look in the case of Singapore, whilst this week it looks like there is a modest increase in capacity, with the ongoing situation there and the increasing number of cases that are being reported, and their circuit breaker tactic, it's likely that that's going to stay around that number for quite some time. So there's a lot of in all of this data, there are, as I say, some strong points, and there are points of optimism, but there are also points where we should recognise perhaps we're going to still be moving along at the bottom of the curve for a few more weeks at least.
Still a bumpy road ahead, isn't there?
There certainly is some bumps on that road, if not a few potholes to fall down as well.
Okay, let's take a look at some of these countries. Just for those of you that are more visual than the table. So India is an interesting one, isn't it? Because still in lockdown, still nothing happening in India's aviation market, and essentially, with the exception of China here, we're not really seeing a positive uplift yet, are we?
No, we're not. There's not much optimism outside of China when you look at these charts. Maybe that little sort of uptick on Japan, but India in itself is a fascinating and rapid reduction in capacity in the space of 3 weeks, from a weekly frequency of about 30,000 flights down to almost zero.
Yeah, I think when we look at that is one of the steepest falls, isn't it, in across any of the country markets we've looked at.
Yes, and obviously that has so many implications for both communities trying to get back and to repatriate to their homes, and also for the airline communities, because these are, certainly in the case of India, it was one of the fastest growing markets in the world, and suddenly to have all of that growth suppressed, capacity taken out, aircraft sitting around. India's aviation market has consistently been a boom and bust market, and of course now we're in a situation where airlines have these assets they're unable to fly. We know that IATA's expectation is a $313 billion revenue impact this year for the industry, and specific markets like India with its range of carriers and their ambitious growth targets, it's going to be challenging for them to bounce back and return to the rates of growth that they were looking forward to at the beginning of the year.
I think that's the unknown, isn't it? How long does that recovery take, and to what extent do you, if you do, get back to how things were previously in terms of growth rates and demand for travel?
Yeah, and sorry to jump in. I was just going to sort of talk a little bit then about, does this then sort of point in the mind a little bit towards consolidation and maybe some of the markets and the airlines that might be most at risk with a prolonged downturn in this way?
I think you're right, Mark. It does. The barriers to entry for airlines have become, in the last 20 or 30 years, the barrier to entry has become increasingly low, which has allowed low-cost airlines to flourish. Many airlines operate, leasing aircraft from companies based in Ireland and things like this, and you have to wonder if at some point some sensible commercial businessmen who are driving and running these and investing in these airlines will actually say, come on, we need to get our heads together and talk and stop competing, but actually look at the bigger picture and the opportunity.
Okay. Let's just look at some of the other markets. And so you referenced some of this, didn't you? So South Korea's domestic market is clearly starting to come back. We're seeing an increase in Vietnam. I think Vietnam Airlines have announced that they're going to start flying again. Thailand looks like it might be worse, through the worst.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful. I mean, you said the market has come back. The capacity has come back.
Yeah, that was wishful thinking. Sorry.
Yeah. Whether the market has come back.
That was driven probably by a story I read earlier this morning about China outbound travellers wanting to get back to Thailand. So yeah, that's where that came from.
Yeah, and I mean, such is the situation at the moment. I know in China, someone was telling me if you want to social distance on an aircraft at the moment, so cheap are the fares that you just pay for 3 seats and you have a row to yourself, and it's no more expensive than it used to be. But I think what it does show is that the airlines are beginning to feel a bit more confidence in the market, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail later, because it's changing airline behavior in some markets where we see carriers putting capacity in, or indeed having not taken capacity out and then subsequently cancelling flights at the last moment or consolidating flights at the last moment, rather than strip them out too early.
I think that's never mind the sort of picture of the last 1 or 2 weeks or the next 1 or 2 weeks. I think over the coming months, even as this starts to build back out, there's going to be a lot of tactical cancellations here, because like we are, sort of speculating and making the best view or best judgment on what we can see. The airlines are going to be doing exactly the same with their kit and capacity, and it's going to be a bumpy road back whenever it really starts to happen, right? There's going to be airlines taking a chance, and then I would suspect in many cases the demand isn't really following through, and what's actually going to be operated is going to be some way less than what they'd hoped.
And classically, we have. Sorry, Don did. And classically, we have a situation where conventional wisdom is that the leisure market books early, and the last 2-3 weeks of booking activity is normally high yield business traffic. Coming out of COVID-19, that wisdom probably no longer is true, because leisure passengers are quite likely to be making last minute decisions based upon what they see in the news and what the latest indicators and lockdowns are. So they're going to be late booking as well. Now, in Europe, if an airline doesn't cancel a flight within 14 days of its scheduled departure date, then it trips into some horrible compensation clauses for passengers and liabilities. So it's, unless for a period of time, and this may be an idea, the European Union waives EU 261 compensation, airlines are going to be putting capacity in and then at 2 weeks notice dropping it so that they can reaccommodate passengers and avoid quite punitive compensation claims. When you're going to have to pay a compensation claim of maybe 80 euros or 150 euros a passenger, when you're trying to stimulate a market and you're selling a fare at 10 euros, that's more than a body blow for an industry that's already lost $313 billion.
Yeah. Okay. Picking up on what you were talking about, Mark, in terms of airlines are finding their way here in terms of their sort of operational approach to operations. We've taken a look here at the cancellations rate against daily frequency in China, and I think this is really interesting, isn't it? What we're seeing is the sort of typical pattern, and we go back to January here. Just to sort of make the point that pre-COVID-19, if we went back into 2019, we would see cancellations running at this sort of rate, wouldn't we? Less than 5%. I think the global average is probably 1% actually for cancellations. we saw this spike, didn't we, when capacity started coming out. And what we're seeing in China now is, so this is the domestic market in China, is the cancellation rate running about 20%. And so that's a real departure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on, Mark.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if you take that line from, you know, effectively the beginning of March out to now, so so a 2-month period sustained at that level, one could make the argument that the Chinese domestic market, more than most, would bounce back quicker than other nations. That's a very broad assumption, but it's arguable, I would suggest. So if that's the picture for the Chinese domestic market, what is the new sort of short-term norm of cancellations going to be for other domestic markets? My sort of suggestion there would be it's going to be higher for a period of time. You know, as each carrier looks at the sort of dynamics of the market they're operating in, I think the challenge about demand just being that bit slower to come back, frankly, whichever segment we look at, right, whether it's short haul business or short haul leisure, whichever way we slice and dice or segment the market, I think we're going to see a reasonable period of higher cancellation rates even than what we're seeing for China. And there are so many.
In the US, we're seeing nearly 40% cancellations in the domestic market. We haven't got the slide in
It's
here.
interesting. Yeah, we're all looking to China for, you know, those optimistic signs of recovery and what is happening, and there is a very strong argument that says they've put back too many flights too quickly, because clearly the market, even with what has been described as cabbage or vegetable fares, is still not quite ready to come back in the numbers that are required. And if you look at the scale on the left-hand side, you know, they're now continually operating on a daily basis around 7,000 domestic flights. I mean, that's a huge amount of capacity that is back in there. You know, it's nearly 4 million seats at this moment in time a week. And demand is just we know not there, which is leading to these levels of cancellations. At some point, it would be very interesting to see what the level of cancellations would have been if capacity or the number of flights had perhaps been nearer the 3,000 weekly number or daily number than the 6,000 that we see here.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you know, we're seeing that obviously in China. The approach in South Korea and Thailand, for instance, is quite different, isn't it? So there's a much more measured return to operating flights, and a much lower
and do you know, if I didn't know this slide was here, my previous comment would have sounded quite sensible and insightful, wouldn't it? But you know, here are two markets where we've seen a much more cautious approach to the reintroduction of capacity and frequency, and subsequently much lower levels of cancellation. It's almost as though, you know, really strip down to what is your core frequency and the absolute minimum that the market needs, and operate that to begin with, and begin to build confidence from there on, rather than inject back 50% of what you had before and expected the market to come back.
And I think just to further sort of strengthen or illustrate that point, we haven't put Japan domestic cancellations, frequency and cancellations in here, but no. When I had to look at it earlier, it's running in the month of April about 25%.
Yeah, and there is a market that sweeps every OAG on-time performance award for most punctual airports, most punctual airlines, you know, and cancellations is one of the criteria in that measurement. And you know, they are the global leaders, and they're running with 20% cancellations. And you know, in Japanese society and culture, to cancel is just not done.
Okay, let's change tack slightly now, and we're getting lots of questions about, you know, what measures are needed to make flying safe, and I think it's really interesting that we've seen airlines, some airlines have come out already and talked about the measures that they're going to put in place about having crew wearing masks and sanitisation and emptying the middle seat, which we'll come back to. But I think it's also very interesting to think about it from an airport perspective. You know, in terms of what might something like an increase in minimum connecting times have on some of the world's biggest airports. John, do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, I hope you're all awake, everyone. We'll test you on this at the end. So we touched upon in a previous webinar about some of the implications and thoughts and thinking that will need to be addressed in the coming weeks as hopefully we come through COVID-19, and one of those is around minimum connecting times. So we run a hypothetical piece of analysis where we asked ourselves, well, what does happen if those MCTs increase? So the classic conventional 45-minute sprint from a domestic to international flight that you see happening in most US airports, and you say, when you see someone running past, they must be a connecting passenger. And then the 90-minute to international. Now, just supposing those connecting windows, those minimum connecting times, had to be stretched out to 120 minutes to allow for deplaning. They had to allow for completely cleaning the aircraft, processing passengers, health checks, port authority checks on passengers, just social
120 minutes feels quite optimistic, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, but, social distancing, going through security screening, etc., etc. So then we looked at the implications of that at 5 major hub airports around the world. So we selected Amsterdam, Dubai, Heathrow, Chicago, and Singapore. So we ran some OAG connectivity analysis, which is a really powerful piece of software that allows you to run these hypothetical scenarios and identify what the implications of that schedule change are. And essentially, with an extended MCT, around 18% of those connections that exist today would no longer exist. Because, you know, airlines schedule very tight connection times because that's what the customer wants. It gives them screen priority in the GDSs, and therefore it gives them the greatest proportion of bookings. But if you take that 18% and then you extrapolate that forward to the top 50 airports worldwide, then that equates to around 400 million transfer passengers a year. And if 18% of them no longer connect, you've got about 72 million passengers pretending they're Tom Hanks stuck in an airport with nowhere to go.
Wow.
So the implication is so dramatic, and this is what airlines are having to wrestle with today, and airports, about how do we change our processes, how do we even handle this? And you know, in this scenario, we've heard a lot of discussion, and we've seen airports closing terminals. Terminal 4 at Heathrow is closed. The North Terminal at Gatwick is closed. US airports are closing particular terminals. Ironically, you might actually need to have more space to handle less passengers, which from an airport perspective and an infrastructure perspective is you know, completely diametrically opposed to what you want to do.
It is, isn't it? Absolutely.
I think that's a really important point, and none of us don't know the answer to it right now. But even in a world that builds back quite slowly, the challenge for airports to, you know, build the right infrastructure at the right time for, you know, predicted growth, all that whole model is going to be turned on its head if design capacity goes from, let's say, 50 million at an airport to the new maximum being 40 million. It just means that unless you do some significant rebuilding or changes to the layout, you're never going to get back to what you had before as a physical design capacity. And then maybe in some airport markets where there's multi-airports in a city system, how does that then sort of trickle down and redistribute demand for those markets, no matter how slowly it comes back? You've suddenly got massive airport capacity that's got a much lower maximum, and how does that then get redistributed? I think the point, with the 18% fall in connecting passengers, I think it kind of hides another story of how many services in the world are sustained because of the connecting traffic. Yeah. So if you suddenly slice off 20% or whatever, how many of those, if you like, point-to-point markets just are no longer sustainable because they don't have that higher yielding connecting traffic, long-haul traffic beyond airport hubs? The impact is going to be a little bit stronger than that.
Well, it is the deck of cards of connecting traffic, isn't it? And the hub operation. As soon as you pull one route, you begin to unravel the whole network. And when you do that, of course, you strip it back down to its bare bones.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the questions we've had is, do we see point-to-point flights becoming more prominent going forward? Would hub business go away, fall away? I think that was asked from the perspective of people will be less keen to connect over hubs and mix with people from, who knows where. But it's
absolutely. But, if those markets have shrunk and there is no connecting traffic and they're only serving local demand, will the consumer be prepared to accept one flight a day, or maybe 3 flights a week, or 4 flights a week, as opposed to a daily connection or multiple connections via various
daily
hubs?
Connections.
Yeah. And it's the new world order. It's the new world order.
Okay, let's move on to our next slide, where we are taking a look at the sort of practical reality. What we've got here is, this is based on a Southwest aircraft, and we're showing the typical daily rotations for this aircraft on a day in April last year, with the usual turnarounds times built in. And then, John, you've
so I sort of applied that hypothetical. Okay, you've got to, regardless of how efficient you are, and Southwest are leading experts in this, the turnaround is now going to be 90 minutes, and you operate the same program and the same line off the same aircraft. Then this aircraft originally wasn't being worked very hard anyway. In all truth, finishing at 17:30 seems like a half day for a piece of metal, but it would go through to 1950, which is another 2 hours on that one aircraft line. Now, that
all sorts
doesn't
of
seem
implications, aren't there?
Doesn't seem a lot, but in terms of crews, airlines drive the maximum efficiency and operating hours out of their crews and their cabin staff. Stretching another 2 hours for many airlines would have implications around additional crewing requirements. An extra 2 hours on every aircraft, physically, in the case of someone like Southwest, who've got a couple of hundred aircraft, you're talking about 600 hours a day. And you divide that by perhaps an average current aircraft utilization of 12 hours, you're going to need an extra 50 aircraft to operate the same program you've got now. And that assumes that you've got airports that are not curfewed and not restricted, and that you don't end up running into someone else's hub at a peak hour because you've extended the times. The implications on this one, and Deirdre, we've got an EasyJet one, I think, on the next slide.
Yeah.
The implications of these are really, really dramatic. I mean, you look at the turnaround.
This aircraft's certainly working harder, isn't it? It's working right through till 10:20 at night.
Absolutely. And just in case anyone's looking there and saying, why is Porto to lose 2.5 hours and it's only an hour or so on the way back, there is a time difference. So these are local times rather than Zulu times. But again, this aircraft, you know, is a classic intensive day's flying, and would normally have finished the day about 10:30. Now doesn't finish until 1:20 the next day. And that crew is doing that plane's doing nearly 3 hours more flying, which is probably about 20%, or is being utilized for 20% more time. It's a scary set of scenarios we face if we extend out to increased turnaround times and have to accommodate port authorities.
I think if we sort of invert the analysis and sort of think about the grey bars for a minute as well, you know, we talked about airports maybe having a design capacity that's going to be, let's just a number, 20% less than what it was before for social distancing and extra measures of that nature. Airports that are on the air side operating reasonably close to what was design capacity before, if you suddenly extend all the grey bars from typical 30-minute turnarounds for LCCs to 1 hour 30 or even more, what does that do to the physical, if you like, infrastructure capability of that airport? So in many cases, even if the design capacity goes down by 20%, because of the available stands and everything else, that might be even a more penal, if you like, limit on what they can actually handle. And it's different for every single airport in the world, but if we looked at a couple of busy airports that are pretty near capacity just now and extended the standard block time to an hour and a half instead of 30 minutes, I think we'd very quickly see a different ceiling to what they could even get from a design.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's an interesting question someone's asked about, you know, well, why don't we just allow airports to be open for 24-hour operations?
Yeah, I was going to ask you that question.
Well, as my two Scottish colleagues will attest, there are airports in Scotland that traditionally haven't liked being open after 10 o'clock in the evening. And, you know, there are major hub airports,
to be open.
major airports in London, for instance, and, you know, Heathrow, right in the middle of a huge residential commuter area and business area. And we've been doing a consultancy project in Japan looking at Fukuoka Airport. And if you ever look at a satellite map and you see how close the houses are to that particular airport, then, you know, many of these major airports, communities, businesses, housing has gathered and clustered around the runway. And 24-hour operations would, I think, in this new world order that we're looking at, would be very, very difficult to get to. I think
there's the cost as well, isn't there, for
absolutely.
airports?
You're going to have to probably double your staff numbers because
fire
it's shift
cover,
patterns. Just not practical. And when do you do your runway maintenance? Because most of the time that's done at 2 o'clock in the morning in most major airports.
Okay, let's go on to our next slide. So again, we've had quite a lot of questions about you know, what is the financial impact going to be on airlines, and how you know, will they benefit, for example, from the low fuel prices currently? We thought we'd take a look at, we mentioned earlier that we've heard about the middle seat concept. And I think there's a wider question, a wider discussion about a set of global standards about social distancing on aircraft and in airports. But this was just simply, okay, let's look at what impact this might have on the economics for airlines. John, do you want to talk us through this?
Sure. So what we did here, prompted in part by some wonderful sound bites and snippets of PR opportunity from Delta and EasyJet saying, you know, we're going to leave the middle seat empty. Guys, you can probably leave the first 15 rows empty at the moment. You don't have to worry about that. We explored and took some guidance from that well-known airline professor, Michael O'Leary at Ryanair, and explored what the implications would be in terms of the current yield that 5 of the world's largest low-cost airlines have been generating. And if that seat was left empty, what they would need to do in terms of increased yield per passenger over a 12-month period to achieve the same revenues as they achieved in their last financial year. And in all, not surprisingly, in all cases, because the maths is the same, it is around a 52% revenue increase per passenger needed to match last year's operating revenues. Now, we've been talking about trying to create demand, rebuild demand, and as part of that, seems to me there are 2 alternate strategies available for an airline, either to go and create and stimulate demand, and there have been no better exponents of that than low-cost airlines, or you assume that demand is completely fixed and therefore charge whatever you want because the consumer will pay that. That is not the airline model that low-cost carriers have adopted. So the key question is, would a passenger out there be prepared to pay 52% more to have the middle seat empty? And my suspicion is, firstly, there's nothing to worry about for the first couple of months because demand is going to be so light as we return. There will be spare seats, but I doubt very much that a conventional low-cost passenger is going to be prepared to pay that supplement, particularly when the passenger behind them may actually sneeze and spread COVID via any other sort of mean on board the aircraft as well.
Or the passenger sitting across the aisle from them, or in the queue, standing
on the air bridge, or anywhere else. It's a bit of a, I think it's a bit of a red herring. And going back to the comment about British Airways being one of the first airlines, or IAG, one of the first airlines to make some really severe cuts. There are 2 people in this industry who always seem to talk good common sense. They're both Irish, and one of them runs Ryanair and the other one runs IAG. And it's no surprise that they're some of the best airlines in the world in terms of profitability and shareholder value as well.
Here's an interesting question from somebody. So I guess in the same way as we saw a hangover from terrorist incidents in the industry, 9/11, and following on terrorist incidents in the last 10 years or so, what of these measures that are being discussed, so not using the middle seat or extending turnaround times, are we going to be stuck with these in the industry? Are these things that are going to remain in the long term, in the medium term?
Good question. I think if you stretch all the way back to 9/11, and you think about some of the behaviour and what was allowed then and what is now allowed, and you take the US market as an example, anyone could wander essentially into a terminal building and walk down to an aircraft gate and all of these sort of things. Even today, we'd probably think that was perhaps too lax a level of security and screening. I think we will certainly see increased processes. We may well see airports having to restrict access to the actual terminal building to passengers with boarding passes or tickets. You may say goodbye to your friends and family in a car park rather than actually in the terminal building. Those weepy moments when people are standing by immigration counters waving to people as they jet off to the other side of the world will probably not happen again. So I think there's lots of processes that will change, and we will live with those in the new world. I mean, post 9/11, for the first few weeks afterwards, you were told to get to the airport 4 hours before your flight. But I think the most important things is that whatever standards are applied in one part of the world are consistently applied around the world to all airports by all authorities, and that the airport terminals are treated in exactly the same way as railway stations and bus terminals in terms of social distancing, to allow travel to resume in the safest possible environment. What we don't need is
we're not seeing any evidence of that yet, are we? I mean, it's early days.
No, we're not. And you know, these you can't call them anomalies because it's a global anomaly. But for a passenger who's trying to help and navigate their way through an airport process, having different restrictions, having different processes in different parts of the world, you know, can I take my hand baggage on this flight and this airline? Yes, no. Do I have to check in 5 hours before? Yes, no. There are so many different processes and requirements that we should really be looking at someone like ICAO to establish operating procedures and parameters that we can all subsequently try and apply to our businesses.
Mm-hmm. But even with something as impactful as this, you've mentioned some of the sort of historical examples as well, John. Even with those and new norms about, you know, security screening and everything else, even within those sort of regulations, there are still so many vagaries and variances throughout the world. Is it ever believable that we'll get to a stage on the back of COVID-19 that there will be a new world standard, if you like, and there wouldn't be countries taking a slightly different view on each of those?
I think especially when we've seen throughout this crisis, we've seen countries react in a very individualistic way. And, you know, it understandably, it's been about protecting your borders. And it's interesting to think about what would then need to be in place to have that worldwide standard. You know, we saw this week, didn't we, that the Spanish authorities were talking about not wanting to accept international tourists to Spain this summer. And there's a bit of a narrative about, you know, because of how the UK approached lockdown. In particular, they don't want British tourists to come this summer.
But I think part of the fear and part of the challenge that we have as an industry, and why we've seen the behaviour we have seen, is because we are dealing with something that is unknown. Now, you know, with the best, you know, it's a horrible thing to happen, but a terrorist incident is a known. You know, they have happened in the past. And frequently there are breaches of security or something that has led to that event happening. But sometimes we become complacent in the processes that we have in place. People have reacted the way they have, and countries have, because of the unknown. If we know what is known and we share what is known, then it would seem to me that establishing some common processes and procedures would, you know, make sense. And don't forget, when if an aircraft is flying to the United States, you know, the first thing that is taken off the aircraft is not a passenger, it's the gen deck, the documents for that aircraft, its manifest, its passenger list, its load, its cargo consignments and everything. So having that same sort of gen doc process around COVID-19, that, you know, is a certification from the airline when it is dispatched from an airport to another airport that it has complied with all of the necessary ICAO standards, would make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the reality, isn't it? That there are so many unknowns still at this stage about transmission of the virus, and you know, social distancing appears to be working, but all of that is still, there's almost an element of it's going to be tested, isn't it, as these markets start to open back up. over the coming months. And that I think perhaps is where we need to get to start to shape what the standards look like, what the global standards look like. Let's move on now to questions. We've kind of tripped into that, haven't we?
We've been answering some as we've been going along. Yeah.
So I think.
Go on.
Yeah, no, interesting question about aircraft types. So, which takes us in a slightly different direction. Have airlines got the right aircraft type to generate profitable revenue in the new world?
Well, if they want to turn A380s and 747s into restaurants on the ground somewhere, then many airlines have got the right fleets. This is accelerating a movement out of ultra large aircraft. And I saw yesterday Singapore Airlines have sent 4 A380s to Alice Springs to sit in the desert there. So, not only are they scrapping them, most of them are being furloughed. And I think there is a sentiment that a smaller 72-seat type aircraft and new variations of ATRs and dash type equipment would give a better match to probable demand in the short term. But the problem with this industry is you can't flex and adjust capacity that quickly and then flex back out again when you suddenly see there is a demand for 150 seat aircraft. So it's the great quandary. Those routes that are regional routes are and have historically been served by regional type turboprops and smaller aircraft types. They will be suffering with the same reductions in demand as the larger aircraft types and the larger, thicker routes as well. So we might like to think that there is a compelling case. And, there are certainly some airlines I can think of in Africa who, for some reason or other, have acquired some of the largest and the grandest aircraft fleets in the world with the latest technology, when quite frankly, an ATR 72 would be perfect for the markets in which they operate. But it's not as simple as a computer game where you can sell one aircraft and acquire another one the next day.
Yeah. Here's the $64,000 question. How long will the new normal last from an aviation perspective before we get back to the good old days?
Good question from Sid. 8:55. Well done for being online. I think the new normal is going to be the new normal for a couple of years. There's another question or an observation about vaccinations, and we could have a vaccine available early next year, and the problem goes away. The problem might go away in its current form, but it will come back in some other form, or that seems to be an opinion that some people hold. So I think we're certainly going to see this change for a couple of years. And of course, as that happens, it's going to be fascinating to see how not only airlines but everyone changes their behavior. If you're on a 6 o'clock flight from London Heathrow to Frankfurt on a February morning, and you now have to do check-in 3.5 hours before departure, are you really going to turn up at the airport at 3 o'clock in the morning for that privilege?
When you've had 3 months of dealing with doing the business that you need to do virtually, I think the potential impact that will have on demand is significant, isn't it?
Yeah, and not only significant, Deirdre, but to our point about 24-hour airports, if you've got to open security 3 hours earlier than you do now, the processing, what does that mean in terms of additional resources there? But I think certainly for the short term, we're going to see a new behaviour.
Yeah, and I think it's been such a sustained period, and it's going to be for a reasonable period more than the implication of establishing new norms around doing business as we are, right? We're all sitting at home doing this webinar. I think the justification for short-haul business travel in particular is going to be under intense scrutiny when we've gone through a period of finding a way to make it work without having to get on an aircraft. So
I think there's also insurance implications, aren't there? So it may be that companies are unable to get insurance cover for their employees to travel.
You can't buy travel insurance in the UK at the moment. No one will underwrite it because the Foreign and Commonwealth has advised that no one should travel. But there's an interesting question someone's raised here, and it sort of plays on a bit to the other things. What impact do we see for general aviation? And we've been asked this quite a bit in the last few weeks. Do we track private aircraft movements and general aviation movements? And sadly we don't, because they're for the rich and famous generally, or for businessmen who work in a very tight specific schedule for some commercial deal they may be closing or other. But there has been a spike in general aviation demand. There's no doubt about that, and some almost ultra long haul stuff as well. I've sat sadly watching Netflix and scanning flight radar in the evening, and you can see general aviation movements operating from as far as the Middle East up out into the east coast of the United States and other markets. So there's been a spike in that type of activity as well.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We're at 9 o'clock. Any final questions? It's an interesting one here, actually. What type of future can you now see for an aircraft like the A220?
For the A320, or the new A320, or the
A220?
A220. It's a lovely aircraft. I've flown on it frequently with Air Baltic, and it's an outstanding aircraft. And it has a great range. I mean, Air Baltic operate it from Riga to Abu Dhabi. It has great range, good performance characteristics. It's in the same place as many other aircraft at the moment, where and nearly every aircraft probably, the matching of demand to that route is why that aircraft was being operated on that route in the first place. So it will be impacted as much as any aircraft. And it's in the case of Air Baltic, I mean, their fleet is now going to predominantly be A220 aircraft. They've retired their 737s and their Dash 8s, and on that basis they'll probably have some aircraft that they'll either be delaying delivery, or may even just be parking some up for a period of time and reducing their aircraft, the asset utilization. But it does lead on to an interesting point, because it is a very fuel efficient aircraft as well, and the price of oil at the moment has never been cheaper. So those aircraft that can give you the best fuel economy for the number of seats operated are clearly going to be the most attractive for airlines in the next couple of months as we come out of this.
Okay, I think on that insight we'll have to leave it there. That's all we've got time for today. If we haven't managed to answer your question, although we've come across quite a few, as I said earlier, we'll do our best to answer them in the coming days. And we will be sending a recording of the webinar to everybody who registered to attend today, and that includes the slides as well. We'll also be sending out a survey after the webinar today, really just trying to assess the sentiment in the industry. So how long do you think measures will be in place for? We're really interested in your views on that. So if you have a couple of minutes to take time to complete the survey, that would be great. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks for joining today, and remember, you can also sign up to the blog to receive regular updates. Thank you to the panelists as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.